The night had a way of swallowing sound. Out on the black waters north of Guadalcanal, even the waves seemed to quiet themselves, as if the ocean understood what was coming. At 2300 hours, on November 14, 1942, the bridge of USS Washington glowed with the dim light of radar screens, soft green circles pulsing in steady rhythm, the only true vision anyone had in that darkness. Every sweep of the SG surface search antenna painted a new picture across those screens. 9 Japanese warships, 18,000 yards away, moving through Ironbottom Sound with the confidence of a fleet that believed it owned the night. To the naked eye, there was nothing. No silhouettes, no lantern glow, not even a shadow. But on Washington's radar, each ship appeared as a living heartbeat, a bright echo against the void. The men standing watch felt the shift in the air. This wasn't training. This wasn't one more drill in a long line of drills. This was real. For 16 months, the crew had practiced for a moment like this, learning to trust a technology most admirals still considered a novelty. The SG radar that could see through darkness. The Mark III fire control radar that could track a target invisible to human eyes. Together, those systems gave USS Washington an ability no battleship had ever used in combat. The power to fight blind, to hit an enemy who never even knew you were there. But back in 1942, the idea that a battleship, any battleship, could win a modern naval fight alone was almost heresy. Official doctrine said such ships were relics, too slow, too vulnerable, too outdated for the world shaped by aircraft carriers. Battleships were escorts now, floating anti-aircraft fortresses built to shield carriers from harm. They were too valuable to risk, the manual said, too precious to waste on surface engagement. The tragedy was that this doctrine had already cost American lives. 3 nights before, those same waters had run red with fire and confusion as Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan led his cruisers and destroyers against a Japanese bombardment force without a single battleship beside him. The result was a nightmare of friendly fire, shattered ships, dead admirals, and a Japanese fleet that walked away nearly untouched. The silence afterward was heavier than the gunfire. And now, as Washington moved through the oily remnants of that carnage, every man aboard felt the weight of what came next. The smell of diesel and burning metal still lingered on the water. Wreckage from American destroyers pushed up against the tide. Bodies drifted in the swells, illuminated briefly by moonlight, before disappearing again into darkness. Ironbottom Sound had earned its name. Yet in that same darkness, something else lived. A chance, faint but real, to change the course of the Guadalcanal campaign. A chance for a ship that had never fired her main battery at an enemy warship to prove that the old doctrines were wrong. That technology, if understood and used properly, could rewrite the rules of naval war. And at the center of that possibility stood a man almost no one expected to become a legendary warrior. Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee Jr. Short, stocky, with glasses too thick, and uniforms that never quite fit, Lee looked more like a school teacher from rural Kentucky than the man about to lead the most important night battle of the Pacific War. But beneath that modest appearance lay a tactical mind unmatched in the Navy, a marksman who had taken home Olympic medals before most of his crew were born, and a commander who understood radar, not as a gadget, but as a revolution. He had spent months restructuring Washington's fire control procedures, wiring radar stations directly into the gunnery plot, stripping out layers of bureaucracy until the ship could respond with the speed of a living creature. While other admirals debated theory, Lee prepared for reality. And that reality was closing fast across a black sea where the Japanese believed only they could fight. Far ahead, beyond the reach of any human eye, the enemy moved with quiet confidence. They believed the darkness belonged to them. For 20 years they had trained for it. They trusted their lookouts, their torpedoes, their battle doctrine. They trusted the night. But on this night, the night was lying to them. As Washington pressed deeper into the sound, the radar picture sharpened. The silhouettes on those glowing screens weren't just blips. They were threats. Cruisers, destroyers, and somewhere behind them, a battleship that had shelled Pearl Harbor and survived everything the Pacific had thrown at her. The men on Washington's bridge stared at those green echoes and felt something rise in their chests. Not fear, exactly, but a recognition of responsibility. If they failed, Henderson Field would fall. The Marines on Guadalcanal would be cut off. The first American offensive of the Pacific War would collapse. The stakes were simple. Hold the line, or lose the island. And to hold the line, someone had to step into the darkness. So Washington kept moving, silent, except for the hum of machines and the quiet voices of radar operators calling range and bearing. The ship was steady. The crew was ready. The night was deep. And somewhere out there, 9 enemy ships steamed forward, believing no one could see them. They were wrong. What happened next would become one of the most decisive and most overlooked moments in American naval history. A single battleship, guided by a commander who understood the future, would challenge an entire Japanese fleet and rewrite the story of the Pacific War. But all of that was still ahead. For now, there was only darkness and a glowing radar screen and the quiet breath of men who understood that in a matter of minutes, their world would change forever. War in the Pacific had a way of exposing every weakness a navy tried to hide. By late 1942, the United States Navy was still reeling from Pearl Harbor, still rebuilding, still arguing internally about what kind of fleet the modern world required. The carrier advocates had won the debate early. Their victories at Coral Sea and Midway seemed to prove that aircraft, not armor, would decide the future. In the halls of Washington and Pearl Harbor, the battleship had already been declared obsolete, long before its crews were ready to accept that judgment. According to official doctrine, a ship like USS Washington was no longer a hunter. She was a guardian, a floating shield meant to defend the true striking arm of the fleet, the aircraft carriers. Admirals wrote that battleships were too valuable to risk, too slow to maneuver, too vulnerable to torpedoes and dive bombers. They were to stay close to the carriers, throwing up walls of anti-aircraft fire, while pilots delivered the real blows. It was a vision of naval warfare shaped more by theory than experience. Washington herself embodied that contradiction. She was a masterpiece of engineering, a North Carolina-class battleship built for a world the Navy was no longer sure it believed in. Laid down in 1938 at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, she displaced 35,000 tons standard and nearly 45,000 at full load. Her 9 16-inch Mark VI guns could fling 2,700-pound shells more than 20 miles. Her armor belt was 16 inches thick. Her turrets wore 18 inches of steel. She was fast, strong, and steady, everything a capital ship was supposed to be. And yet she spent her early life being told the era she was built for was already over. Before coming to the Pacific, Washington had crossed the Atlantic to serve with the British Home Fleet. She had shadowed German raiders, escorted convoys, and watched the gray horizon of the North Atlantic roll endlessly beneath her bow. She had trained, drilled, and waited. But she never fired her main battery at an enemy warship. Not once. For a crew that had dedicated years of their lives to mastering their ship, there was a strange melancholy in that fact. A battleship is built to do one thing above all others, to fight another battleship, and Washington had been denied even the chance. When she arrived in the South Pacific, nothing changed. She was tethered to USS Enterprise, the last operational American carrier in the theater. Enterprise was wounded, operating on a patched flight deck after the Battle of Santa Cruz, but she was still the centerpiece of the fleet. Washington and her sister ship, USS South Dakota, were ordered to protect her at all costs. They were not to engage enemy surface forces except in absolute emergency. And for reasons carved deep into the Navy's doctrine, the definition of emergency never seemed to include surface combat. That doctrine came with a price. On the night of November 13, 1942, just 3 nights before Washington's moment, Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan led a force of cruisers and destroyers into Ironbottom Sound. They entered those waters not because their ships were ideal for the task, but because they were the only ships the Navy was willing to risk. Their orders were to intercept a Japanese bombardment group headed for Henderson Field, the only American airfield on Guadalcanal. Callahan's ships were brave, but they were blind. The few radars they carried were older SC sets, far less precise than Washington's SG. Their crews had trained for many things, but night surface combat was not one of them. And the Japanese had spent 2 decades perfecting that art. When Callahan's column ran headlong into Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe's bombardment force, 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, light cruisers, and destroyers, the night erupted into chaos. Searchlights snapped on. Star shells burst overhead. Ships maneuvered at point-blank range, unable to tell friend from foe. American cruisers fired on each other. Japanese destroyers flashed through the dark, loosing deadly Type 93, long lance torpedoes that exploded with the force of small earthquakes. The heavy cruiser San Francisco took a direct hit from a 14-inch shell that killed Callahan on her bridge. The light cruiser Atlanta was torn apart by gunfire, some of it American. The destroyers Barton, Cushing, Laffey, and Monson were sinking or dying. The cruiser Juno, damaged and limping away, was torpedoed and lost with nearly all hands, including the 5 Sullivan brothers. 706 Americans died in that one night. The Japanese lost only 2 destroyers. One of their battleships, Haii, was crippled, but she survived long enough to be sunk by aircraft the next day. The disparity was staggering. The lesson was unmistakable. But doctrine, unyielding, inflexible, remained unchanged. When Admiral Chester Nimitz read the after-action reports at Pearl Harbor, he understood how close the campaign had come to disaster. The Marines on Guadalcanal were exhausted, fighting malaria, hunger, and constant bombardment. Henderson Field, the prize both sides were willing to die for, was barely holding on. The Japanese were sending nightly waves of cruisers and destroyers to shell the airfield, and American forces had no surface ships left in the area capable of stopping them. The defeat of Callahan's task force was not just a tactical loss, it was a strategic emergency. And then worse news arrived. Intelligence warned that another Japanese force was steaming south, a larger, stronger group under Admiral Nobutake Kondo. This new force included the battleship Kirishima, 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. Their mission was clear: obliterate Henderson Field, sweep aside any American resistance, and cover the landing of 11,000 fresh Japanese troops. If they succeeded, Guadalcanal would fall. The Marines would be overrun, and the first American offensive of the Pacific War would collapse into blood and defeat. Nimitz now faced a choice he had spent his entire career preparing never to make. Every principal taught at the Naval War College warned against sending battleships into night combat without carrier support. The Washington, South Dakota group existed to protect Enterprise, not leave her vulnerable. But Enterprise's air group was depleted. Her flight deck was fragile. She could not stop Kondo's bombardment. And no other U.S. ships were left to intervene. If Nimitz held his battleships back, Henderson Field would be destroyed. If he sent them forward alone, they might never return. It was a decision between losing the campaign or gambling the last heavy ships in the South Pacific. In the end, Nimitz chose the gamble. He ordered Admiral William Bull Halsey to release the battleships. Task Force Chile 4, Washington, South Dakota, and 4 destroyers, was to intercept Kondo's force in Ironbottom Sound. They would go without carrier support. They would fight at night. They would challenge a Japanese fleet trained for precisely that kind of battle. And they would do it under the command of a man who had spent his life preparing for a moment the Navy insisted would never come. Rear Admiral Willis Lee Jr. received the orders with characteristic calm. He understood the risk. He knew the waters they were sailing into were littered with the dead. But he also knew something the doctrine writers did not. Washington was ready. Her radars were ready. Her crew was ready. And for the first time in the Pacific War, the United States Navy was about to enter a night battle with the ability to see farther, react faster, and strike with unprecedented precision. As Task Force G4 turned toward Guadalcanal, the Pacific stretched out before them, dark, quiet, waiting. The tragedy of Callahan's defeat hung over the waves, but so did the possibility of redemption. The war was balanced on a knife's edge, and the outcome would depend on whether Washington's new way of fighting could overcome Japan's mastery of the night. The future of the Guadalcanal campaign, and perhaps the future of naval warfare itself, was rushing toward them through the darkness. Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee Jr. was the kind of man you could pass in a hallway without realizing you'd just walked by one of the sharpest tactical minds the U.S. Navy ever produced. At 54, he was short, stocky, rumpled, and perpetually slightly out of uniform. His glasses were thick. His Kentucky accent softened his words. He looked more like the local schoolmaster from some quiet Appalachian town than the commander of the last American battleship force able to stand in the way of a Japanese offensive. And yet no one in the Pacific that night was better prepared for the kind of battle that lay ahead. Lee had spent his entire life learning how to shoot rifles, pistols, anything with a barrel. At the 1920 Olympics in Antwerp, he had taken home 5 gold medals, 2 silvers, and a bronze in marksmanship. He could put 10 bullets through the same hole at 1,000 yards. He understood wind, motion, lead, and trajectory not as calculations, but as instincts. When he transitioned from rifles to naval guns, the skill came with him. A 16-inch naval rifle was just a very large rifle, he liked to say. The principles were the same. But the truth was simpler. Lee could see angles and timing the way musicians see music. Yet it wasn't his marksmanship that made him the right man for this moment. It was something more unusual, his grasp of technology. Where others saw radar as a gadget, a helpful supplement to lookouts or searchlights, Lee saw a revolution. He understood that a ship with radar didn't fight at night. It fought as if night didn't exist. The Japanese had spent 20 years mastering darkness. Lee intended to erase it with electricity. Months before the order to intercept Admiral Kondo's fleet, Lee had begun transforming USS Washington into a different kind of warship. The Navy's standard fire control process was slow and layered. Radar operators would report contacts to talkers, who relayed the information to the gunnery officer, who then issued orders to the directors and turret crews. It was a chain of communication designed for daylight, for visual spotting, for a world that no longer existed. Lee tore that system apart. He rewired Washington's internal circuits. Radar operators were connected directly to the gunnery officer. The Mark III fire control radar fed information straight into the plotting room. The chain of command in battle became lean, fast, and almost organic. One man spotted, another aimed, another fired. No middlemen. No delays. No room for uncertainty. Every day at sea, Lee drilled his crew. Hundreds of hours of tracking exercises. Radar-directed practice salvos. Simulated targets. Repeated failures, followed by refinements. The crew didn't just learn radar, they learned trust. They learned to shoot at targets they could not see. They learned to fight a type of battle no battleship had ever fought in combat. This system had never been tested in a real engagement. Washington had never fired her main battery at a live enemy ship. But Lee believed in it with the quiet certainty of a man who knew the difference between theory and practice. He knew that warfare changed when new eyes replaced old ones. And Washington now had the sharpest eyes in the Pacific. Task Force C4 sailed toward Guadalcanal with a composition that looked formidable on paper. Two of America's newest battleships, USS Washington and USS South Dakota, along with the destroyers Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn. But the truth beneath the numbers was far more fragile. The task force was a patched-together group that had never fought together, barely trained together, and in some cases, couldn't even talk to each other properly. South Dakota had just arrived from repairs after being damaged at the Battle of Santa Cruz. Many of her crew were fresh from stateside training. They had never fought alongside Washington. The destroyers came from different task groups, each accustomed to its own routines, signals, and internal procedures. There had been no time, none at all, for joint exercises or standardization. The first problem Lee encountered was almost laughable in its absurdity, if the stakes hadn't been so high. Washington and South Dakota carried incompatible radio systems. Their talk between ship circuits operated on different frequencies. Their identification signals didn't match Navy standard. For several minutes, Lee believed the sets were malfunctioning. Only after troubleshooting did he realize the truth. The ships literally could not communicate properly. So he improvised. He ordered a communication plan built around signal lights, prearranged maneuvers, and restricted radio use. In a battle that would likely rely heavily on coordination, Lee knew he would be commanding half-blind. But he also knew that he had no alternative. The enemy would not wait for repairs. The destroyers, courageous but lightly armed, faced their own impossible task. Their 5-inch guns were effective in close combat, but hopelessly outmatched against Japanese cruisers and the looming presence of Kirishima. Their only real offensive weapon was the torpedo, but to launch those, they would have to close within 10,000 yards, squarely inside the killing range of Japanese long-range guns. On paper, they were the screen. In reality, they were men walking into a storm. While Task Force 64 pushed west around Guadalcanal, the sea began to change. The air grew still, the moon dipped, and a hush settled over the water. This was the same path Admiral Callahan had taken 3 nights before, and the ghosts of that battle were everywhere. Oil slicks drifted like dark rivers. Bits of shattered hulls and broken lifeboats floated by. Now and then, a piece of scorched wood or a life jacket bobbed to the surface. Here and there, the bodies of sailors still drifted, faces pale, uniforms torn, the sea rocking them gently as if trying to lull them back to sleep. The men of Washington did not speak when they saw them. They stood at their stations in silence, some clenching their jaws, others looking away. This was Ironbottom Sound, a place where failure was measured in lives, not mistakes. The destroyer's decks were quiet as well. Everyone knew this was sacred water. American dead, Japanese dead, wrecks lying stacked on the bottom like layers of history. But there was no turning back. Intelligence had provided a clear picture of the enemy force moving toward them. Admiral Kondo was bringing firepower. The battleship Kirishima, armed with 8 14-inch guns. The heavy cruisers Otago and Takao, each carrying 10 8-inch guns. The light cruisers Sendai and Nagara, and 9 destroyers packed with the deadly Type 93 Long Lance torpedo. 14 ships, all trained for night combat. All confident that no American battleship would dare challenge them in the dark. The Japanese Navy had earned that confidence. For 2 decades, they had studied night fighting with religious devotion. Their lookouts were legendary, men with eyesight so sharp they could pick out ship silhouettes at distances American sailors considered impossible. Their star shells turned night into day. Their torpedoes could run 12 miles at 49 knots, with warheads that could break a cruiser in half. Their destroyer tactics were polished to perfection. The darkness belonged to them. But Kondo did not know that an American battleship with modern radar was heading straight for him. He did not know that Washington could see his ships long before his lookouts had any chance of spotting her. And he certainly did not know who was commanding the American force. As the sun fell on November 14th, Task Force 64 slipped deeper into the Sound. The destroyers took the lead, steaming in single file. Behind them came Washington, steady and silent, her radar operators hunched over glowing screens that displayed the coastline, the islands, the approaching enemy contacts. South Dakota followed close behind, her crew anxious but ready. Inside Washington's radar room, the operators spoke in low voices as the screens pulsed. They could see Salvo Island. They could see Guadalcanal's mountains. They could see aircraft returning to Henderson Field. And soon, they saw something else. Small green echoes moving in formation. Enemy destroyers sweeping ahead of the main Japanese force. Lee stood on the bridge, listening quietly. He knew exactly what he was seeing. The Japanese vanguard was approaching. The battle was coming. And the next decisions he made would determine whether anyone in Task Force 64 would survive the night. The range closed, 20,000 yards. 18,000. 16,000. The radar picture grew sharper. Kondo's formation was entering the Sound. His destroyers were fanned out ahead, his heavy units behind. Everyone was moving with confidence, unaware of the trap forming in the dark. Lee understood he had 2 options. He could open fire immediately, strike from long range using radar, hit the Japanese before they even knew he was there. Or he could wait, let them come closer, let them commit to their bombardment run, trap them in a place where escape was impossible. It was a terrible gamble. If the Japanese spotted the Americans first, their torpedoes would tear Task Force 64 to pieces. But Lee also knew something the Japanese did not: the movement of the U. Battleships had been kept so secret that many American commanders didn't even know they were coming. The Japanese would not expect a surface engagement today. They were not looking for battleships. Lee made his decision. He ordered his ships to maintain silence. Hold fire. Watch the screens. Wait. It was a choice only someone who understood radar and trusted it with his life could have made. As the range closed to 14,000 yards, men aboard Washington felt their heartbeat rise. They gripped railings, adjusted headphones, tightened hands on firing levers. The tension was not panic. It was readiness, the same feeling a marksman feels right before he exhales and squeezes the trigger. Darkness settled deeper. The sea remained unnaturally calm. And the enemy kept coming. The battle that would define the future of naval warfare was about to begin. The sea had grown so still that it felt less like water and more like a polished sheet of black iron. At 2300 hours, the quiet shattered. Rear Admiral Willis Lee gave a simple, steady order. Open fire! And the night exploded. From the deck of USS Washington, 9 16-inch rifles thundered into the darkness. The muzzle flash momentarily turned night into daylight, casting harsh, brilliant light across the ship's superstructure before plunging everything back into blackness. The roar rolled across the Sound like a physical force, pressing against every chest on board. It was Washington's first salvo in a surface battle, and it was fired at a target no one could see with their own eyes. Only the radar could. The shells took 23 seconds to reach their mark, arcing through darkness toward the light cruiser Sendai. The salvo missed, but the near stratos sent towers of water erupting around her, drenching her decks and throwing her crew into sudden panic. They knew instantly these were not cruiser guns. They were being fired upon by a battleship. But Sendai wasn't Lee's priority. She was a distraction. Washington's radar plot had identified a more immediate threat, the Japanese destroyer Ayanami, leading the van. The destroyer posed deadly danger to Lee's own destroyer screen. So Washington shifted fire. The next salvo found its mark. At least one, possibly two, 16-inch shells tore through Ayanami. Against the destroyer's thin hull, the effect was apocalyptic. One shell ripped straight through the engine room, detonating deep inside. Machinery vanished in fire. Bulkheads tore open. Flames erupted through the superstructure. The destroyer went dead in the water, burning from bow to stern. It was the opening blow in what would become one of the most chaotic and violent surface battles of the Pacific War. Within seconds, the Japanese force responded. Star shells burst overhead with blinding white light, painting the sea in harsh shadows. Searchlights stabbed through the darkness, crisscrossing wildly as Japanese ships tried to locate the American attackers. Every gun that could fire did so. Tracers streaked across the water like fiery needles. It was déjà vu of Callahan's disaster 3 nights earlier, except this time, the Americans had radar. But radar couldn't save everyone. Ahead of Washington, the destroyers Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn charged forward, knowing exactly what fate waited for them. Their role was to get close enough to launch torpedoes, close enough to stare down the muzzles of Japanese guns. Walk was first. She ran headlong into a storm of Japanese fire. Shells from cruisers and destroyers ripped through her hull, smashing her bridge and igniting fires below decks. Before her captain could order the crew to abandon ship, a shell detonated one of her magazines. The explosion tore the destroyer apart. Men were thrown into the water. Burning fuel dripped down like molten rain. Walk sank quickly, taking most of her crew with her. Behind her, Preston suffered a similar fate. Trapped in a murderer's crossfire, she was hit again and again. Flames engulfed her. Ammunition cooked off. When the order to abandon ship finally came, it was already too late. Preston disappeared in a fireball, 117 men dying with her. Benham fought as long as she could. Then a long lance torpedo struck her bow, blowing it completely off. Miraculously, the ship did not sink immediately. Watertight bulkheads held. But she was out of the fight. Drifting, shuddering, powerless. Gwynn, last in line, was burning but still afloat. Her captain made a cruel but necessary decision: retreat, pick up survivors, and live to report what had happened. In the space of 15 minutes, the entire destroyer screen had been annihilated. 4 ships gone or crippled. Dozens of men dead in the water. And now Washington and South Dakota stood alone. South Dakota should have been Washington's equal. Another modern battleship, heavily armored, well-armed, fast. But war rarely honors what a ship should be. At 23:17, disaster struck her. A minor electrical issue, something a chief engineer normally resolved in seconds, triggered a catastrophic mistake. A crewman, attempting to fix the fault, threw the wrong breaker. Instantly, South Dakota's entire electrical system collapsed. Lights died. Radars went black. Gun directors froze. Ammunition hoists lost power. Communication lines fell silent. In a heartbeat, one of the most powerful warships in the Pacific was reduced to a blind, deaf hulk. Emergency diesel generators kicked in, but they could only power bare essentials. The ship could still fire, barely, but she was fighting blind, without radar, without coordination, without the ability to direct her guns accurately in the chaos of night. The Japanese noticed immediately. Searchlights from Kirishima, Otago, and Takao snapped toward the towering silhouette of the helpless battleship. What followed was a slaughter. Every Japanese gun that could bear down on her opened fire. Heavy shells smashed into South Dakota's superstructure, tearing apart antennas, radar sets, and directors. Secondary batteries shredded her upper works. Splinters swept across open decks. In just 90 seconds, South Dakota took 27 hits. Her captain, Thomas Gatch, was wounded. 38 sailors and 1 Marine were killed. 59 more were injured. Fires burned along her decks. Communication antennas were gone. Radars destroyed. The ship was alive, but barely. She limped away, trying desperately to escape the killing lights, leaving Washington alone. In the chaos, the Japanese believed South Dakota was the only battleship present. Every spotlight, every torpedo, every heavy gun focused on her. And Washington? She remained unseen. Hidden behind the burning hulks of Walk and Preston, shrouded by smoke and darkness, her radar signature masked by the wreckage around her, Washington became a ghost in the night. She was the only fully functional American warship left in the battle. One battleship. Against 14 Japanese ships, including a battleship of her own. Every war college manual said the same thing: withdraw. Preserve the ship. Save the crew. Regroup with the carrier. But Lee didn't look at manuals. He looked at the radar screen. And what he saw changed everything. The Japanese formation, so tight, so elegant, so disciplined at the start, had come apart. Some ships chased South Dakota. Some circled burning destroyers. Some lost track of their own positions in the glare of star shells. The Japanese were scattered, confused, and unaware that a second American battleship was still in the fight. Washington had an opportunity no textbook had ever imagined. She could attack. Lee gave the most audacious order of his career. Maintain radio silence. All lights off. Maximum speed. Course 030. Washington turned sharply and began to accelerate. 20 knots, then 23, 25, 26. Her bow cut through the dark water like a blade. Her engines rumbled deep within her hull. Men steadied themselves at their stations, waiting for Lee's next move. Radar operators called out contacts in whispering tones. Kirishima, range 15,000 yards. Atago, 12,000. Takao, 10,000. Destroyers closing from port. Washington was slipping straight into the heart of the Japanese fleet. The Japanese still hadn't seen her. At 8,400 yards, point-blank range for a battleship, Lee chose his moment. Commence firing. What happened next would enter naval legend. Washington's 9 16-inch guns spoke as one. The salvo rocked the entire ship. The recoil trembled through her steel spine. Fire leapt from her barrels, lighting the night for miles. The shells screamed toward Kirishima, who was illuminated by her own searchlights as she pounded South Dakota. Washington's first salvo straddled her. The second hit home. Then the third? Then the fourth. Shell after shell, 2,700 pounds each, slammed into Kirishima with annihilating force. One destroyed her forward turret. Another wrecked her machinery spaces. A third tore open her hull below the waterline. A fourth smashed her steering gear, jamming her rudder hard over. Kirishima began to circle helplessly, blind, dying, unable to fight back. Washington's secondary batteries joined in, sending over 105-inch shells ripping through her upper works. Fire spread across her decks. Her bridge disintegrated under the rain of steel. Within minutes, Kirishima was finished. She was the first Japanese battleship sunk by an American battleship in the Pacific War. And she had been destroyed by a single ship, fighting alone. Washington wasn't done. She turned her radar-guided guns toward Atago and Takao, forcing Admiral Kondo to make the only decision he could: retreat. The most powerful Japanese surface force sent to Guadalcanal fled into the night. Washington sailed on, unharmed. Not a single crew member killed. Not a single critical system lost. In the most violent surface battle of the Guadalcanal campaign, the ship that dealt the greatest destruction suffered the least. And she did it with one man, Willis Lee, reading a radar screen in the dark. When Admiral Kondo realized what had happened to Kirishima, the truth must have struck him like a physical blow. His flagship, the ship he believed would dominate any American surface force, was dying under the guns of an enemy he hadn't even known was there. He had assumed the night belonged to Japan. He had assumed American battleships would never risk a close-range night engagement. He had assumed South Dakota was alone. All of those assumptions failed him in the same instant. As Kirishima burned and listed, Kondo made the only decision a commander could make under the circumstances. He ordered his cruisers Atago and Takao to lay down covering fire and launch torpedoes. Then he turned to retreat. 16 Type 93. Long lance torpedoes churned into the night, streaking toward Washington with deadly purpose. Under normal conditions, the spread would have been enough to cripple any capital ship unlucky enough to be caught broadside. But Washington was not caught. Her radar tracked the torpedo wakes, marking their approach in real time. Lee ordered a hard turn to starboard. The massive battleship heeled over, engines thundering as she accelerated north. Torpedoes passed behind her, some missing by mere yards. It was the kind of maneuver battleship captains were never trained to attempt in night combat, because before radar, such evasive action had been impossible. The cruisers tried to pursue, firing blind in the darkness. Washington's gunners responded, directing salvos at long range, forcing the Japanese to break off. One moment they have been the hunters. Now they were the hunted. By 00:20, the Japanese force was in full retreat, slipping back into the same blackness they had used so effectively for years. But the night no longer sheltered them. The sea, once their greatest ally, had betrayed them. Radar had stolen their advantage. Behind them, Kirishima was dying. Aboard the stricken battleship, chaos had given way to grim resignation. Fires raged through her superstructure. Flooding spread unchecked. Her rudder was jammed, her engine shattered, her lifelines broken. Damage control crews worked desperately, pumping, patching, praying, but the wounds were fatal. Captain Iwabuchi Sanji remained at his post even after being injured. His officers still tried to slow the ship's flooding, but the list increased steadily. At 01 o'clock, with the main deck slanting at a perilous angle, Iwabuchi gave the order to abandon ship. His crew gathered, exhausted and soot-stained, and sang the Japanese national anthem. Then they gave 3 final banzai cheers for the emperor. One by one, they went over the side. At 03:20 on November 15th, Kirishima rolled over and sank, taking nearly 300 members of her crew with her. She became the first Japanese battleship lost to American naval gunfire in the Pacific War. And her killer, USS Washington, had not taken a single fatal casualty. It was unprecedented. It would never happen again. And yet it would be almost forgotten. Kondo did not know how many American ships he had faced, or what had destroyed Kirishima so completely. His report to Tokyo claimed American cruisers and destroyers had been responsible. The truth, that a single American battleship had shattered a major Japanese surface force, seemed to him impossible. But the consequences were undeniable. The Japanese troop convoy that was supposed to land 11,000 reinforcements found no cover when dawn broke. American aircraft from Henderson Field descended on them like hawks. Dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked relentlessly. 7 transports were sunk. Among the 11,000 soldiers aboard, only about 4,000 made it ashore, and almost none of their equipment or supplies survived. They arrived on Guadalcanal hungry, poorly armed, and already defeated in spirit. Japan's last, best chance to retake the island evaporated in a single morning. The Guadalcanal campaign had turned. Victory did not come cheaply. The destroyer Preston was gone, taking 118 sailors with her. Walk was gone, with 175 dead. Benham, mortally wounded, would sink the next day while under tow. Gwyn survived but burned, battered, and alone. In total, the U. Navy suffered more than 400 killed during the night. South Dakota, though still afloat, was severely damaged and would require months of repairs. Her scars, twisted metal, shattered radar, burned decks, told the story of what she had endured. Yet Washington, the ship that had stood alone in the thick of battle, bore almost no wounds. One 5-inch Japanese shell had cut a radio antenna. That was all. Her crew, every one of them, was alive. It seemed impossible. But nothing about Washington's performance that night was ordinary. When Admiral William Halsey received the battle report, his reaction was immediate and effusive. He sent a personal message to Lee. You and your task force have written a glorious page in American naval history. But officially, silence. Classification. Downplaying. The battle was labeled a defensive victory, not the offensive breakthrough it truly was. The fact that radar had enabled Washington to dominate the night was noted, but not celebrated. And Lee's after-action reports, explaining the revolutionary tactics he had used, were filed away with little commentary. Why? Because Washington's triumph contradicted the Navy's dominant belief that battleships were obsolete and carriers alone would decide the war. Carrier admirals didn't want to admit battleships still had offensive value. Battleship admirals didn't want to admit they had underestimated radar. Bureaucracy won out over innovation. The revolution Washington represented was quietly set aside. Lee was not the kind of man to seek glory, but he was a realist. He knew what Washington had proved. He knew radar-directed gunnery could transform night combat. He knew independent battleship operations, including ambush tactics, rapid radar-guided target shifts, and long-range engagements, could save lives in future battles. He wrote detailed reports on integrating radar with fire control, on rethinking night battle doctrine, on improving communication between major units, on training every ship in radar-directed gunnery, on using technology to strike before the enemy saw you. Most of these were ignored. The Navy was already moving to the next campaign. When Tokyo finally intercepted American radio traffic confirming Washington's role, disbelief gave way to something far deeper: fear. For the first time in the war, a Japanese battleship had been defeated, crushed in surface combat. And worse, it had happened at night, the arena Japan believed it had mastered beyond challenge. The psychological damage was immense. Their lookouts, their torpedoes, their training, none of it mattered if the Americans could see them in total darkness. Japan scrambled to catch up, rushing to produce radar systems, but they were years behind. Their new tactics were reactive, not proactive. The initiative had shifted, and they would never fully reclaim it. After brief repairs at Noumea, Washington returned to service. Her crew finally understood the scale of their achievement, not just that they had defeated a battleship, but that they had done it alone, in darkness, using a style of warfare the world had not yet recognized. They would never again fight a surface battle like Guadalcanal. The Navy kept Washington close to the carriers, using her formidable anti-aircraft guns as a shield. She supported invasions in the Gilberts, Marshalls, Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. She earned 13 battle stars, more than most battleships in the Pacific. But she would never again fire her big guns at an enemy warship. The tragedy wasn't that Washington became an escort. The tragedy was that the Navy ignored the lesson she had taught at Guadalcanal. Battleships with radar could dominate surface combat. Independent action could work. Technology could overturn doctrine. The Navy forgot. And by the time it remembered, the age of the battleship was already ending. Lee continued to argue for modernization, for integrated sensor weapon systems. After the war, the Navy finally embraced ideas he had championed, but too late for the battleships he loved. Modern destroyers and cruisers used the Aegis combat system, a direct descendant of the radar fire control revolution Washington demonstrated. Modern naval doctrine, beyond visual range engagement, electronic battlespace management, precision tracking, is built on principles Lee defined. Yet Washington herself rusted in reserve, decommissioned in 1947, scrapped in 1961, without memorial or museum. A ship that saved Guadalcanal became razor blades and rebar. History forgot what bureaucracy didn't want to remember. But the legacy remained, written not in monuments, but in how modern navies fight. In the long sweep of the Pacific War, with its vast distances and its thunderous carrier battles, the night action off Guadalcanal on November 14-15, 1942, can seem like a small, isolated spark. There were no great fleets clashing in daylight, no screaming dive bombers, no newsreel film to capture the moment. It was fought instead in darkness, deep, quiet, heavy darkness, broken only by the glow of burning ships and the flashes of guns no human eyes could see until it was too late. And yet, in that darkness, the future of an entire campaign, and perhaps the survival of thousands of Americans on Guadalcanal, was decided. The story of USS Washington is not the story the Navy expected to write in that desperate autumn. She had been built for a grand battle line that no longer existed. She had been relegated to the role of guardian for aircraft carriers. She was never meant to fight alone, never meant to hunt in darkness, never meant to prove the worth of a doctrine the Navy had not taught and did not yet understand. But wars are shaped not by doctrine, but by the men and ships that rise to meet moments no one foresaw. Washington rose. Under the calm, methodical command of Rear Admiral Willis Lee, Jr., she brought to bear a new way of seeing and a new way of fighting. Radar, still distrusted by many senior officers, gave her the eyes of a hunter in a world that had always belonged to the hunted. Her crew, drilled to exhaustion in a system no one else had tried, carried out their duties with precision rarely witnessed in the confusion of night battles. The Japanese entered the Sound confident, disciplined, and overwhelmingly strong. Their destroyers swept forward with the elegance born of long practice. Their cruisers moved in practice formation. Their battleship Kirishima, veteran of Pearl Harbor, steamed forward, prepared to deliver the blow that would shatter Henderson Field and open a path for 11,000 reinforcements. But they entered the night assuming they owned it. That assumption was their downfall. The American destroyers who formed Washington's screen paid the price first. They fought with courage that defies easy description, charging straight into a storm of torpedoes and gunfire, knowingly sacrificing themselves so that the battleships behind them might have a chance. Walk, Preston, Benham, Gwynn, their names deserve to be spoken with reverence. Their losses were grievous, their courage unquestioned. South Dakota, caught in a disastrous electrical failure at the worst possible moment, took the weight of the enemy's wrath. She became a beacon in the night, lit by searchlights, hammered by heavy shells, bleeding fire and steel. Her survival, even in that crippled state, stands as a testament to her construction and the grit of her crew. And then there was Washington. Silent, unseen, waiting. The moment Lee chose to attack, slipping his ship into the heart of the Japanese formation, was one of those rare decisions in naval history that reflects not only courage, but genius. Washington emerged from darkness with all 9 of her great guns trained on Kirishima. Her radar told her exactly where to strike. Her gunners, calm despite the chaos around them, delivered salvo after salvo with clinical precision. In minutes, Kirishima's fate was sealed. A ship that had survived Pearl Harbor, that had fought across the Pacific, was undone by a battleship fighting in a way no battleship had ever fought before. When it was over, Washington stood almost untouched. Not a single sailor aboard her died in the action. The ship that had taken on a Japanese task force alone emerged with only a clipped radio antenna to show for it. Historians often speak of turning points. They debate which battle mattered most, which decision carried the greatest weight. But for the Marines clinging to Henderson Field, for the pilots who needed that airstrip to keep the skies open, and for the sailors who knew how close they were to disaster, the night Washington fought alone was the night the tide truly turned. It was not the largest naval battle. It was not the most celebrated. But it was decisive. A single American battleship, guided by technology no enemy possessed, and commanded by a man who understood its potential, shattered the final Japanese attempt to retake Guadalcanal. In doing so, she helped secure the first major American offensive of the Pacific War and opened the long, grinding road toward victory. And yet, Washington's triumph faded quietly. Doctrine moved on. Admiration was muted. Her achievement slipped beneath the waves, much like the ship she sank. But history, properly told, restores what memory forgets. And the memory of Washington deserves restoration. Washington's quiet victory reveals something deeper about war and the institutions that wage it. Time and again, innovation does not rise from boardrooms or classrooms. It rises from men like Willis Lee, who see possibilities in tools others dismiss. It rises from crews who practice relentlessly to master skills no one has yet proven in battle. It rises from ships whose moment arrives not by design, but by destiny. The night off Guadalcanal proved several truths that resonate even today. 1. Technology changes war faster than doctrine accepts. Radar was treated as an accessory, not a weapon. Washington proved it was both. 2. The service that adapts fastest wins. Japan mastered night combat until the night changed. They never fully recovered from that loss of advantage. 3. One ship with the right commander can alter the course of a campaign. Washington did not merely win a battle. She saved Guadalcanal. 4. Bureaucracies resist lessons that challenge existing beliefs. Washington's success threatened both carrier doctrine and battleship tradition. So her lesson was softened and then forgotten. 5. The greatest victories often go uncelebrated. No memorial honors her. No museum preserves her steel. Yet her legacy endures in every modern naval combat system built on the principles Lee pioneered. In a sense, Washington exists today not as a hull, but as a blueprint. As long as radar guides weapons, as long as ships fight beyond visual range, as long as commanders trust innovation over tradition, Washington sails with them. If this story moved you, if you believe USS Washington, her crew, and Admiral Willis Lee deserve to be remembered, then I invite you to keep this history alive. Like this video so more people can discover the forgotten battle that saved Guadalcanal. Subscribe to hear more untold stories of courage, innovation, and sacrifice from World War II. And in the comments, tell me, had you heard of Washington before today? Do you have a family connection to Guadalcanal? Were you surprised by how close the campaign came to disaster? Your voice helps ensure that the men who fought in the dark and the ship that altered the war are never forgotten again. Thank you for remembering them.